Anyway, thank you for coming, and thank you to our speakers as well, John and Dora. I hope you've had a very fruitful stay so far in Amsterdam. And thank you for giving us this opportunity to engage with you. The purpose of the Diverse Europe group, of which I have only been a part now for a few months, is basically to encourage a kind of dialogue between faculties, so between law, social sciences, and humanities. So I'm the humanities person here. And the idea is to generate a kind of interfaculty dialogue. So, we hear from you, we hear from John, and then we perhaps have questions from the audience that encourage us to think in cross-disciplinary ways. So the topic of today's event, European belonging or membership, itself indicates that we are coming at citizenship from two different perspectives, the legal, the formal, but also the anthropological, the everyday perspective of citizenship. So very briefly about it, the speakers have already apologized for reading from my phone, but John, who's an anthropologist from Princeton and who's been doing ethnographic fieldwork in several places, including Syria and Lebanon, but also in Germany, France, Norway, and has written on intimacy, kinship law, psychoanalysis, political form. His most recent publication is an edited volume digesting difference, migrant incorporation and mutual belonging in Europe. So we look forward to reading that. And Dora Kostakopolou is the chair of the Scientific Committee of Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union and a professor of European Union law, European integration and public policy at Leuven University. So thank you very much. I myself am Sudha Rajagopalan. I'm in East European studies. I do Soviet cultural history and Russian digital cultures. So as far as possible from your particular interests, but hopefully it will help create some sort of dialogue, right? So the program for the afternoon is that you've done a fair amount of public talks, I imagine, in the last few weeks. So it's for you to say a few words or many words about your research, your current project, and then I'll perhaps engage a little bit with you, and then we'll take questions from the audience then. So who would like to go first?
For you.
Yes, of course I would. So I've been working on EU citizenship, aspects of EU law, freedom of persons, and migration law and policy for ages. Mostly public law issues which also engage with political science and international relations. And as I was talking to the students this morning, it had been absolutely essential to cross-disciplinary divides and to incorporate a number of very, very interesting and stimulating insights from history, from philosophy, from sociology, from economics, from phenomenology, philosophy. So I have been enjoying this kind of work, and I'm an advocate of a kind of post-disciplinary world, whereby the boundaries among disciplines become very, very porous, and there is people can talk across disciplines and incorporate each other's insights and see whether they can come up with a different solution to problems or a different way of seeing things. So the EU itself as a subject invites a multidisciplinary lens. It's almost impossible to discuss European integration, political integration, without putting the emphasis on the economics of integration, or the history of European integration, or the history of the European idea, or the politics of European integration, and now the lived experiences of Europeans. And therefore we have a very interesting European sociology scholarship which is emerging on the lived experiences of European citizens. So that is encouraging and very, very nice. So as a result of this engagement, it has become more or less customary to cross-disciplinary divides without feeling that you're trespassing, or without feeling that you are an alien within them and you might make a fundamental mistake and about the work and scholarship of the scholar. It has been a very, very enjoyable exercise and very, very important in theorizing the issues that I wish to theorize. So I continue working on EU citizenship, and at the same time I have been working on research methodology, as we discussed this morning, a kind of zooming out from a particular subject and trying to discuss possible constructivist approaches and what I call institutional constructivism, and applying it to various issues within the European Union.
Okay. Yeah. John.
Okay, so thank you all for coming. And so in 2015, when the big wave of refugees from Syria primarily entered Europe, I switched and began a new project. So initially the project was on these people as refugees, but very soon they didn't want to be refugees. They didn't want to be called refugees. Now, of course, some of them did. Those are not the ones I focused on. So I ended up with a focus on about 35 young men, say under 30, but not the juveniles who came, not under 18, although some of those people now I also know because they're over 18. You know, the human subjects approval doesn't like it when we talk to people who are young. So the thing is, the project is changed. It's a project now about incorporation. So why is that? And so I think the pressing question in immigration for Europe, but also the United States, is that, although these other issues are not negligible, for instance, how many people do we allow in? What's the status of a refugee? Do we have to, when do they apply? And what are the conditions of changing from a refugee status? All that's important, but the fact is that people belong to a place without being citizens. It's like, I feel at home here, or they're citizens and they don't feel at home at all where they are. So I realized after 2000 in Germany, they changed the citizenship law after a long time to allow Turks who had been there as guest workers and their children to become citizens. Actually, maybe a third over time applied for citizenship. This was very disappointing to the Germans. They thought they were opening things up. And then around after like 2010, all of a sudden they found all these young men who didn't want to marry any Turkish brides in Germany. They wanted to get them from Anatolia or from Turkey. What that meant was the whole process of what we called German Turks was turned back, right? Where actually then they were learning Turkish as a mother language, and they, only the mother basically who is the one who communicates language. This was also very disappointing to the Germans. And thirdly, in elections, the parties that wanted citizenship reform, that argued for them, like the Greens, the Turks hardly enter them at all. Chaz Özdemir, there's a politician who's made it, and the Greens was very prominent. But basically, this idea that they're more loyal to Turkey than to Germany, nobody really wanted to take up. It's like, no, that's anti-immigrant rhetoric, but actually, it's very true oftentimes. So just to say that the idea of legal citizenship is a problem because it's so narrow, not that it's not important and that we don't want this legal status, but it doesn't speak to belonging and who wants to stay in a country or a place if you don't belong there, not simply for instrumental reasons. So therefore my focus shifts, or let's say, primarily focuses on belonging. Now within my discipline still exists, even though we may want to borrow from others. Citizenship has been multiplied. Now there's something called biological citizenship, sexual citizenship. I always find this multiplication kind of nonsensical because it means that word is vitiated of its meaning. I think it's really important to have legal citizenship. When you don't have it, call it what it is, temporary protected status, right? Tolerance for a certain period, in Germany. But the point is, I'm not sure it's in the same status to have biological citizenship as it is to have legal citizenship or sexual citizenship. So anyway, but my discipline basically has gone there, totally. I'm an outlier here in how I approach this. And I think it's very important to understand, to come up with terms that are rigorous enough to explain what we're actually experiencing and not simply casting them in a light that we think is favorable to immigrants or refugees. So, okay, so my focus on then incorporation is not integration. I went back and forth, should I call this integration? If you all think the word assimilation, who uses it today? It was a very common word. Nobody assumes anybody can really assimilate anymore. Who's done that work? Certainly not politicians. It's intellectuals who've changed the discourse. Not necessarily even the immigrants who said, I don't want to be called assimilated, right? I mean, they may be talked up. But this is one of the kinds of work we can do, is work on the concepts and introduce them, refine them, and drop them. So the idea of integration, which has been very useful and, say, prominent in Europe, certainly better than assimilation, I've rejected this term as an analytic term. And the reason is, to be integrated into something means that something you already know what it is, and it doesn't have to be fixed, but the social unit is considered stable. And that is simply not the case. What is Dutch or German or British is highly contested and divided within these countries. And so I want an idea of the social body as something unstable and possibly changing. And my questions are, under what conditions does it change? So my question for the immigrants also, these former refugees, many of them got citizenship this fall, they've been there 7 years, is what are the conditions that they might successfully feel like they've been incorporated into Germany? Now, what are the grounds for incorporation? How can we make that concept more vigorous? And so one of the grounds is to be desired in the place you're living. To everybody look past you or through you or see you as someone who's unattractive and not desirable is a horrible experience, much more alienating than not having citizenship in itself. Right, so how does that come about, that you live in an environment where people see you and where they actually think you are part of that in some way you're desirable? It doesn't have to be sexual, but also, of course, sex is very important. So this is one of the functions of my work, is to try to understand what it is that makes a particular place not just livable, but desirable to live in, where one feels incorporated into the social body, and the social body and those people who say are leaders within it also feel like you are part of it, like the outsider is a part. And so that's basically the focus of my work. I'll stop there and we'll make discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. So I guess I have a few questions based also on what you've just said, but what I've read of your work before this. Maybe start with you, John, because you brought up incorporation. So the idea of incorporation, which is problematizing the term integration, to what extent does incorporation, in a sense, balance out the burden of creating belonging or adjusting, whereas with integration, the burden falls primarily on the migrant or the refugee? How does incorporation change that?
It requires a reconceptualization of the social body by the people already there. So it's a mutual necessity that you recognize that the body has changed and that you have 10% people from another minority group that weren't there, or all these people, the children in the schools are, of course, a huge issue and problem. They don't speak German usually. Their parents don't. That's a new problem for German schools, like in the last 20 years. And depending on what district, high concentration immigrant districts, the incorporation has to be that the teachers change their teaching strategies to incorporate these other languages, or people who don't operate at the same level of language and still they have to learn math or science or whatever. So the idea of incorporation must include some idea of mutuality to make it efficacious, because otherwise it's just integration, right? No matter what the immigrants do, they will satisfy the criteria of integration or not. And the problem, one of the problems I see with integration, for instance, language, I do think that, especially in Europe, say more than the United States, though the United States is very unstable, as you all know today, what it means to be American. But the language facility in the local language is a very important issue for people across the political spectrum. So even though here in Scandinavia, English can reign, so a non-Dutch language, nonetheless, I think that to have a competence in Dutch for citizenship. So therefore, learning German is a barometer of the eagerness of the people to understand the native dialect and not replace it. So everybody's heard of the Great Replacement Theory.
No, I haven't.
No, it's kind of nonsense, but politically it's very important that all the white people are being replaced by all these minorities from other
far right.
groups. No, it's also middle right, center.
Really?
Yeah. So it's just a fear thesis, but basically that, you know, and it's true, there's a darkening of population having to do with genetic dominance, darker genes. But the point is, this fear of replacement by immigrants is a huge issue in Europe, in countries with the right, but not just the right, the center. I mean, the right's growing beyond the narrow right. So the idea that the immigrant or the new population is eager to enter into this body linguistically, just saying that's one example, where it's not a right-wing issue. It's an issue for the idea that you live in the Netherlands, that you have some facility in the local dialects or.
Yeah, well, thank you. Mutuality then, right, is key. Also, I had a question for Dora, because you mentioned a post-disciplinary view of citizenship. And I was wondering, as we problematize integration, how does citizenship look different in a post-disciplinary perspective? What happens to it?
Okay, so that's a very, very nice question. And I'm going to use this question also as a platform in order to respond to what John said earlier as well. So citizenship becomes as plus, 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 plus. So you integrate sociological insights about the origins of the concepts of assimilation, for example, integration, the work of sociologists in the 1920s and later on. You integrate the legal evolution of the concept of citizenship, because you need the law, you need formalism. As John said, it's important to retain the idea of citizenship as a status, as a legal status. You look at the politics and the relations between majority, minority communities, claims making, rights that are being awarded, and also international relations, the relation between the country of residence and the home country, and it becomes a combination of various insights. History, colonialism, for example, we are here because you were there. It's also important. Anthropology as well, the importance of culture. What do we mean by culture? Why should we respect cultures and not people with cultures? And the right for people become important questions to be here. That's right. In terms of, I fully agree with what John said, and the description that he gave does not only apply to migrants, but applies to all sorts of outgroups. It applied, for example, to the poor in America in the 1950s and 1940s. Any outgroup of society is seen not only as different from the majority, middle class, upper class, or whatever, representing itself as the majority community, but also as inferior, as having deficits. So there is always a relationship of subordination there. We assume the deficit, and we assume that the deficit will somehow cease to exist if they attend education classes, if they attain professional qualifications, if. And this assumption of a deficit, of course, projects the insecurity of the majority community and the partial perceptions they have about various outgroups, and imposes burdens on minority communities to adjust, to adopt, to embrace various things. But it's has always been a relationship, a hierarchical relationship, and a relationship that assumes deficits that need to be overcome. So with integration and integration programs, they try to somehow reduce the bad name of integration by saying, okay, we're not imposing burdens on people. It's not in a one-way street. It's always a two-way contract. And that's why the French imposed contracts of integration. But these contracts were mandatory, you can't say, no, I'm not interested in signing your contract. Oh, I'm sorry, I was not consulted about terms of my presence here. Nobody asked me about, whether I have an interest in learning how cider in Austria is being produced and being examined, on this information. So it was always, even though it was seemed to be or advertised or pronounced to be a two-way contract, has always been an imposition, mandatory integration is imposed on minorities. Why? Because the number has to be reduced. So somehow they function as filters in order to reduce the number of people and impose a number of obstacles in family reunification, for example, by demanding spouses to take language exams in the embassies of countries of origin or transit countries and so on and so forth, therefore infringing people's fundamental rights, essentially making integration very difficult. Because if you are in a country without the presence of your loved ones, your children, your spouse, and you feel on your own within a very difficult environment, it is highly likely that your mental health and your sense of well-being will suffer. And therefore, any form of incorporation, of integration, is going to be not as well functioning as it ought to be. So,
yes. I mean, this kind of, I guess, this dissonance that you're talking about, right? The dissonance between how you're supposed to perform and how you actually feel is also what you brought up with the difference between being a citizen but not actually feeling like you belong. And I was just curious because in studies of Soviet society, we talk about performing and speaking Soviet as opposed to actually feeling Soviet. And I was wondering if there was such a thing as performing European, which was at odds with the way people actually felt in this whole struggle between being a citizen and actually feeling like you belong.
Well, I've become critical of the idea of performativity. And the thing is, you perform a script. So you learn the script. And this is the move, theoretically, I don't particularly appreciate, that the immigrants should learn a script. Or for instance, for me to be American, I have to learn a script. Many of those scripts, should I be John Wayne, or who are the masculine heroes of my time, right? So even the scripts for masculinity and femininity have changed. And so that's not necessarily where my my look should be oriented, right? So I don't think there is such a thing as performance of Europeanness or even Dutchness or Britishness, but there we run into the problem with authenticity, another term that's oftentimes very critically understood today. You don't feel yourself, you're simply performing for others, and that is not, it's not healthy to always be performative. You have the spontaneity in your gestures and your sense of yourself that should be cultivated. I think any psychologist would claim that. So therefore, the idea that you perform, you learn how to perform something, I'd put it this way. You learn what the environment, what the habits, let's talk about habits. You learn what the habits are here. So for instance, bicycles. Is there an Amsterdam or even Netherlands without bicycles? I doubt it. Can you imagine that today? I mean, so what do the immigrants do who come, who don't ride bicycles? Well, I mean, it's odd.
They buy one and they ride.
Well, that's the question. And so for me, and for instance, with the Syrian refugees, of course, it took over 2 years to get them to ride bicycles. In Syria, they ride bicycles for fun, but not to go places. They all took the transportation system, which was actually very cheap for them because they got huge reductions as refugees, which discouraged them from learning how people their own age would move around the city. So learning that, it wasn't that they were necessarily following a script. They were being seduced into the idea, I can get here much faster and have some exercise and sort of fun, right? And sort of the things about living here, habits that are enticing. People don't adopt them simply because they're a script, because, hey, this is a nice thing to do. Say restaurants, or even sanitation. How do you throw your cigarette butts around, or do you don't have that much of a problem with Syrian refugees because hardly any smoke because they're Muslim. But but you have sanitation rules like where people throw their garbage and they leave it outside their apartment. These kinds of things are habits. There is a script. You don't put your shoes outside the door. You keep them inside. Or you can put them out, but only in the space in front of your apartment. It's not that there aren't scripts, but it's not where I think we should be focused, right? That it should be a kind of a function of neighborliness, that you find out what your neighbor's conditions are to be not hostile to you. And then you go from there. And the same with the things that are fun, like visiting parks, but you don't walk 4 men in a row because nobody can pass you, right? Which is actually what they do in Istanbul, in Syria. So you learn that that's simply not a friendly way to do things here. It's not necessarily following the script, right? They can do that when there's no. So, but you learn these things, but then your reaction to it is like, this is something I could do too, instead of I'm not following the rules. And I think that a kind of enticement, seduction is what policy should be oriented to. Of course, you can't tell people to seduce somebody, right? So you know, you need other methods to communicate. So my work's focused on this interaction between Germans and Syrians and how they learn to interact with each other, which is a learning process, and not learning each other's scripts, which would be, this is the cultural script for Arabs from Syria, and this is the cultural script for Germans from Germany. And so, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I do get what you're saying, but I mean, in the Netherlands, for instance, there's actually quite definitely a script in the integration exam that you take, which I had to take. And it was very clear, although no one had actually taught me what it meant to be integrated, I could infer from the questions what was supposed to be the correct answer. You know, so there is a script in some ways. Perhaps it's mostly unspoken, and perhaps it's mostly.
No, there's a script, but it's not sensical. If you look at the Danish citizenship exam, right? They learned some poet from the 17th century. It's like, no, that is not the script to be Danish, because Danes don't follow it too. And that's why the whole idea of then embodying this, even if you're fair and say, I really want to get a script that's accurate and useful, it's simply not the way. The test is not the way to judge whether somebody is wanting to live here.
No, not at all. In fact, the question was in fact about the dissonance between that, between not being able to follow that script or whatever you might call it, and looking at, you know, sort of living in the Netherlands or Germany in other ways. One of the things that sort of comes up, and I infer from what John says, and I was curious about, especially in this post-disciplinary perspective, is also emotions. And certainly as someone who comes primarily from the field of law, what role have emotions begun to play in understandings and articulations of law, or citizenship particularly?
Like, I've read some good books on law and emotions. John Elston, I think, has written on that. Psychology of law as well. But in terms of Europe, and I go back to the previous question that John asked, you see, the advantage of the European Union is that it does not have a police force or coercive apparatuses to force people to behave in a particular way. As you said, in Russia, you have to speak or perform without feeling that you belong there. So there is this freedom to embrace or not to embrace Europe. And at the same time, there is also the freedom for those who live in countries that are not members of the European Union to embrace the European Union as a form of resistance to various policies in those countries. And that's why you see the citizens of Georgia and Moldova and Ukraine, they're very much pro-Europeans with the European flags. Europe means something very important to them. And also the citizens of Turkey as well, because Europe is associated with the rule of law and democracy and respect for human rights, respect for the rights of minorities, something that does not exist in Turkey. So this a performative aspect of European identity is very, very important to them. The same could apply to various national units within Europe. For example, the Scots are very, very proud of being Europeans because this is a way of declaring their opposition to Brexit. And also the sense of independent thinking as well. And this is something that is also embraced within Europe. It's a form of, in the same way that we don't have one form of nationalism and we say that all nationalisms are absolutely bad and horrible and should cease to exist. But there are various forms of nationalism, various forms of articulation. Some have to do with liberation, others have to do with anti-colonial struggles and so on and so forth. And therefore we have to make various distinctions when we discuss about performance in the context of the EU and how we feel. Now, in terms of citizenship and emotions, within the citizenship literature, there has been emphasis over the last, I would say, 25 years on notions of identity. And when we discuss identity and identification, you have to take into account feelings and emotions and your perceptions of feelings and emotions of yourself and others, and how these become intelligible. So the citizenship literature, mainstream citizenship literature, does not disregard these questions. But of course, this issue is not relevant in the context of the EU, precisely because in terms of the European institutions themselves, because they see the European Union as a community of law and politics. And of course, they know that people do not fall in love with the internal market and mutual recognition and pure values, and they want to see the European flag and Europe Day and so on and so forth. In other words, symbols of European integration, they want to enhance them as well. They know that in reality it's not feelings that keep Europe together or unite the European project, but common values, shared values and principles. So these principles are legal and political, respectfully about that. So equality, freedom, democracy, cooperation among units, non-discrimination, fundamental rights.
Right, but a post-disciplinary perspective would change that, right? Because then it would sort of take into account the experiential dimension of citizenship as well. I mean,
it would just be more, let's say, enriched in a sense, because if they wanted to examine the everyday experiences of people and feelings of belonging, within a conception of citizenship that incorporates legal and political elements, they could do that. That would have to do with the, let's say, functionality of citizenship or how citizenship is experienced. The phenomenology of citizenship. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. Okay, well, I just have one question, and maybe we can open it up to also, I see people in the Zoom session. The question of public mood, because I saw an earlier work of yours, John, on public mood, also a topic that's very interesting to me. In cultural studies, we talk about affective atmosphere, sort of sense of a sentiment, the sort of sentiment that hangs in the air that you can't quite, put a finger on. It's both a presence and an absence. And I was just curious, maybe from both of you, what your sense of the public mood is now in the context of Ukrainian refugees coming in, and how that is perhaps different from what you've worked on in your work on xenophobia in Germany.
Well, it's interesting how the Syrians refer to the Ukrainians. Many of them resent them getting so much, right? The open welcome. And I always say, yes, but look at the position of you vis-a-vis the Afghanis, the Ethiopians, all these other people who came, which then they're usually quiet. I mentioned that, but the point is, the Ukrainians come and the other thing is a German friend of mine started talking about problems of integration of Syrians. And he said, look, the Ukrainians the men are fighting. And look at all these young Arabs here. Right, they left. So I thought, well, this is very interesting. This is a gender dynamic and the perception of that the women and children should be protected, but the men should fight. Still very common. This wasn't a Syrian, this is a German. He works for the chancellery. I've known a long time, he's a very bright man. But this assumption that women and children need protection, and men don't necessarily need it, that they're considered a penetrative force or an aggressive force, and therefore immigration policies are not as friendly to them. Well, the Ukrainians also are planning on going back, totally different than the refugees from the Arab countries who came, right, after a failed uprising revolution. So that means when the Germans, I think it's generally true in Europe, the Poles, when they look at Ukrainians, they assume they're not going to stay. That's Zimmel's definition of stranger. Someone who comes and stays is actually going to leave. And this is a dangerous, this is a, let's say, this is a thought that de-escalates their emotional resistance to Ukrainians, getting a lot of attention. So the public mood, to go to your question, you know, when they, with the failures of the Arab Springs, and, you know, Berlin now has more Syrian intellectuals, they think, that are in Syria. I mean, real intellectuals, not just people who occupy the positions. You know, they have the whole intelligentsia from the Arab countries who left. It's fascinating how they all end up here. In one city, but in Europe, they're not spread around. I mean, there are some in Frankfurt and whatnot, but the Ukrainians, it's not the case, right? I mean, they still have a country that many of them can live in and whatnot. So the mood, the German mood was, of course, totally split in 2015, right? And very intelligent people were saying, we have to set a number. You know, then the public will tolerate this idea that a number is going to solve this whole thing. When you look, it wasn't 1 million refugees from Syria, it was 300,000. Most of the people who came to Europe were immigrants from other European countries. So, okay, but that's lost kind of in the number game. Yeah. So my point simply, this mood, which was a very ambivalent public, which Merkel did a lot to try to channel it into a more welcoming mood, which actually created this term, Willkommenskultur, welcoming culture. What do people say now? It's not an issue. It's not an issue. So this alarmism about numbers, is too many now, the capacity of societies to deal with this, even though they don't want to, is great with these numbers. I mean, if we go to Asia, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, and think about the refugee situation there, and the numbers and the poverty of these people, and the regimes also not being wealthy. I mean, Europe is in a good location. So the mood today is still, you know, we have these right-wing parties in Italy and now Spain, with Le Pen likely to win the next election because Macron has not done anything for a successor. This is, you know, they're trying to build on aspect of the mood that allows them to channel the frustrations into anti-immigrant discourse. It's why I think we have to think about in what terms can we frame these things that make sense of the everyday for everybody, and not simply a tolerance discourse or a discourse of integration that's somewhat above their experiences.
Yeah.
Right? And like criminality being a very important issue for public, even when there's hardly any crime. So that just has to be addressed, as opposed to letting the right wing occupy these terms that we use. Yeah. So the mood is, I mean, myself, I'm very interested in mood shifts among small groups, like a group here, where everybody just is upset, bored, and how the group coheres into a mood and creates a mood. So I'm interested in really documenting mood in a more rigorous way. And not using opinion polls, which here I'm totally against multidisciplinarity. When they think an opinion is going to elicit some facts that I can then have used to determine all sorts of other things that have to do with more depth than an opinion. I can say anything I want, my opinion, right? Yeah. And I will change it tomorrow if I want. They say opinions are stable, but that's because the questions are so simple.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, a public mood in the way that you imagine it and not opinion surveys at all. In fact, I think Ukraine is very interesting because it kind of occupies this liminal position, right? It's European, but not quite
Yes.
European. And with Syria, it's a completely different case.
Totally corrupt.
Sorry?
Totally corrupt. I mean, it's liminal position because it's also totally corrupt. It's not really democratic.
Yeah, well,
Right?
yes, yes.
Yeah, we don't want to talk
But
about
I'm not,
in some other EU member states, I would say.
yeah,
That may be
exactly.
true. That
And
may
I'm
be
not really
true.
sure how much of a factor that is as well in people's articulation of how they
It
feel.
isn't right now.
It
You're
isn't right now,
It isn't right
yeah,
now.
yeah.
No.
Yeah. Do you want to say something about the particular context right now, mood and or emotions or the general atmosphere in which Ukrainian refugees are being met?
Yes, I fully agree. The important point is for how long this will last.
Mm.
Yes, and this is something that is really unknown. And it's wonderful that the Temporary Protection Directive was activated for the very first time. And then the question that has been asked is, why wasn't it activated 2015 when we had the Syrian exodus? And is this a manifestation of European racism?
Mhm.
And then on top of that, there were the reports of how third country nationals living in Ukraine fleeing the war were treated when they were reaching the Polish border, for example, and the Hungarian border. And this gave rise to more criticism about differentiation among people who are equally vulnerable because they flee the same area under the same conditions of force. And having said that, and even though we had a welcoming approach on the part of most of the people, there have been also quite a lot of incidents of sex trafficking, child trafficking, and awful exploitation of women and children. That so we see the best if you want, and we see some ugly faces of humanity as well. And therefore, I'm not sure that the public mood could account for the complexity of what is happening, and also the politics that are being played among EU member states, because the member states are comfortable with Poland having millions of Ukrainians, for example, and financing Poland, insofar as those people do not travel to other European destinations, even though they have the right to travel. And at the same time, the Commission is happy to turn a blind eye to Poland's disrespect of the rule of law, insofar as now they have to take care of this population. Without the efforts of the government, they will not be able to do it. So the dynamics change, and the dynamics are much more political and complex than simply ascertaining the mood of the population, which is shifty always and very, very difficult to rely upon. And it, of course, if it's a mood, it can be manipulated very, very easily by politicians and populists. So, yeah, so I haven't done any work on mood, even though Brexit relied quite a lot on mood of the population. But I could see how Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage's right-wing Independence Party manipulated the people and were creating narratives, false narratives, in order to persuade to vote in favor of the exit of Britain from the European Union. So, and they were creating a certain kind of mood, which did not last long, because people realized that there are enormous gaps now, labor market gaps, and they cannot possibly get the nurses and the doctors that they need. And therefore, migration is no longer among the top areas of concern. Yeah. In fact, they would like more. There was during the pandemic EU drivers and EU seasonal workers, because strawberries are rotten in South England, and there isn't anybody to stock supermarket shelves during the night and so forth. Yeah. Yeah.
Can I say something just to your work? So the position of Russian men today, it's very interesting to ask, would Europe accept these, right? Fleeing the Russian regime, because actually asylum is not granted on the basis of deserters. I was really interested in Syrian deserters, and I found out very quickly that they don't qualify for asylum based on that claim.
Syrian deserters don't.
Deserters don't, it's not in.
Oh,
That's
okay.
really interesting. You can't desert as a, you know, persecution. It has to be a group persecution and not because you're in the army. So it can be any kind of army. You can't escape it and claim asylum in some other
So
place.
even one that's waging a war against you.
Yes, it's horrible. So anyway, now all these Russians who
Yeah.
are escaping, it's
Yeah.
fascinating to see. Of course, the West wants them to escape, right? Where it's publicized in all the newspapers, but what legally, but also socially, what would be the readiness of Europe to accept these men? I just asked the question. I think they would be not very ready, but I don't know.
Well, they don't appear to be ready, right? I mean, haven't a whole number of states already said that they will not allow Russian male deserters to come in?
Did they?
I think the
they
Baltic states have.
have they? Yeah,
The Baltic states
Yeah.
have said they won't
That's
let them
right.
in.
that's
The
right.
other states have said that they would be welcome.
Who has?
I think Germany, the Netherlands is also.
I see.
They
I
said
think the
what?
discussion is going on.
It
I
is
think
now.
it has moved from, I mean, a couple of weeks ago, it was more like we're not gonna let any tourists in. You know, now with the mobilization, they're, I think, thinking of changing strategy, which.
Really,
Okay.
it's really interesting.
Yeah, because I think the Baltic states quite categorically said day before yesterday that they're not welcome. But I'm not sure to what extent that's actually become policy or law, because I think they still have lines of cars at the border, so they're probably letting them in. But yeah, it's really an interesting question. Yeah, what kinds of sort of demographics you allow to filter in, and yeah, it's also very controversial. There's a lot of people who are saying, well, we can't possibly deny them asylum simply because we believe they need to stand there and wage a war that's immoral and unjust, and you know,
Right, that's done all the time.
conscientious. Yeah,
It's
but
done
it's
all the
done
time, but now we're supporting, we're opposing this war in an aggressive way as a kind of Cold War unification of the West. So
Yeah,
it changes the whole
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
strategy.
Yeah. So maybe questions from the audience, and also those of you in the Zoom session.
Concerning the deserters that want to come to the EU, I think maybe they could qualify under refugee status, because if they, for example, face imprisonment in Russia for 7 years or longer, or less long as sufficiently, or 10 years, then it's, I think, sufficiently serious to be called as an act of persecution, individually targeted. And the reason of persecution is that they are conscious enough to believe that that is a war crime. They want to exit that. So maybe I think that there is a possibility for Russian deserters to get the refugee status in the EU.
Okay, all right.
Well, you should look. I mean, I don't know, but all I know is in the Syrian case, it's group membership that qualifies for refugee status and not individual fate. So individual threat, you know, even rape, it's a category of an act, right? I mean, deserters, it just wasn't allowed as a criteria. It'd be very interesting if the law is more complex than was understood at the time.
Yeah, I've never thought about this. Yeah, it'd be really interesting to see how things develop.
It does have to do with the Geneva Convention of Persecution, for the fact that you are part of, or also not in an individual case, but your prosecution,
because you're a member of a group based on religious, sexual, that list all these criteria of the groupness, cultural, but not, I don't want to fight in your army. It's understood they're going to die for their country everywhere.
Can I say something about that also? In case of Georgia, because now we have more than 100,000 Russians coming. We came to Georgia since March, and every day we have 10,000 Russians coming. And the public understands why these people leave actually Russia. But on the other hand, there's a discourse among Georgian public that says that they were silent all this time, and they even supported Russia's actions in Ukraine. But now when they have the chance to actually be killed, then they escape. If they escaped before, would be fine, but now it's too late. This is one of the most prominent discourse at this moment in Georgia,
Yes.
and people are against.
Yes, I mean, it's kind of really kind of tragic to see the bar being raised every day for how Russians must behave in the context of war. I mean, it feels
Horrible.
Yeah, it feels terribly unjust because, people make the decisions they do when they do, and we're trying to kind of read their personal histories into their little acts, and it just feels.
Yeah, I understand that. Sorry to chime in.
No.
For example, my cousin, Georgian, living in Russia, he was born there, and it's his country. I mean, but he just came now. I also understand the humanics, the human side of it. Of course, I cannot say that, well, you're not allowed to come to Georgia. But what have you done like the last 25 years? You even didn't say one word against the government. You were just working there, earning money, and you were happy. And now you're moving. And I was just a little bit frustrated about that. Of course, he has to come to Georgia to avoid these terrible things, to be part of war crimes. But yeah, this is also inside me, and I'm thinking
I
like that.
understand, yeah. I mean, obviously, I don't know about your cousin, but in general, lots of Russians have been resisting for 25 years, and things weren't so bad, right? I mean, in a way, the situation has escalated beyond our worst imagination in the last few months. And also, this is one of the things that's being held against the EU, right, for not having foreseen this. And that's also because for many people, things seemed to have stabilized a great deal in Russia. And there was resistance, there was dissent, there was all of that. It just feels like it's all escalated in a very short period of time. So I can imagine that Russians are also taken by surprise, but I don't want to go on because it's also not about my work, but
it's an issue
your
we're
work.
discussing.
Yeah. But then thank you so much for bringing that actually to this, because it's such a current and actual thing that we're all facing at the moment.
Yeah, but what you bring up is the emotion, your question, that enters into this, even though you're trying to be totally rational. What are the grounds for them coming or leaving? Why didn't they do this? And it's like, there's other things that play in, the whole emotion against their lack of resistance. I mean, right?
Yeah.
That mobilizes in you, and that's, how we make decisions, how we ultimately make decisions, right? It's not an opinion you're offering here. Ultimately, it's much more an informed relation to them, to two countries, etc., right? Yeah. To family. Yeah. Especially given such a complex history that these countries find themselves in, right? I mean, it's 1991 wasn't really very long ago, so I think it's a very recent history. Yeah. Any questions in the hall?
Can I just follow up here, because I wonder whether this can also influence the mood in Russia itself. And what could that do? So
that's right.
Mood. Because I read this morning, I think it was a letter from a Russian newspaper saying that until now, most Russians have seen the war in Ukraine as something maybe a bit far away. Yeah. But now suddenly it becomes part of your life.
Exactly. And that becomes a much stronger analytic term, not as an opinion expressed, but as something, I mean, just looking at the pictures and published, the faces of the Russians who are staying, amazing mood shift, right? Yeah. Showing their anger, their sadness, different kind of things that aren't necessarily verbalized in those situations.
Yeah. Are there questions in the Zoom auditorium?
Can they speak without clicking them on or something?
You can speak. They should be able to speak.
Yeah.
If they have questions. Or also the chat can be used.
Yeah. If any of you in the Zoom session have questions, then feel free to post them either in the chat or you can speak up. Robin does.
Can I ask a question to John? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
About this incorporation, can you give an example of what could perhaps be called a successful incorporation. When can we speak of incorporation? Take, for example, the British Indian community that seems to, well, there seems to have been large pockets of support for Brexit among the British Indian population. Maybe Sudha can tell us more about that. But no, but would that, for example, be an example of incorporation according to you?
I have a colleague at Princeton who's looked at political incorporation, and she used as her measure whether the immigrants are voting when they vote. That seems to me to be absurd, studying new immigrants, that they're going to learn the candidates and vote. They just left a country which they were politicized in, right, for the first time in Syria. And all of a sudden, it's like they want nothing to do with politics initially. I would say you must learn these politicians, which party wanted to represent you, right, sort of thing. But my arguments are kind of beside the point, or they were. So the thing is, I'm losing track of what your question was about incorporation. So political incorporation, the Brexit issue, yeah. I'm not sure. Okay.
British Indians particularly, I think. Yeah.
But the thing is, if it's about political incorporation, like do you support conservative parties or say Brexit initiative as a Brit now? I think we need to think clearly about what that is at a more fundamental level. Like Dora was mentioning, democracy, the rule of law. I mean, I don't want to reduce political identity or political affiliation simply with electoral policy or something like this, right? Or measure it by whether they're supporting a certain platform or not. That is very popular in this country, right? But by the principles that sort of Brits might believe in. And these principles are oftentimes simply norms. Like, do you stand in a queue instead of go ahead of the line, right? Something everybody who goes to Britain, even Americans, have to learn. I find the queues here are very interesting also.
Non-existent.
Yeah, but people don't butt ahead. I haven't been here long enough. Anyway, I thought people are very polite, but very limited experience. So, but anyway, the idea of, it's a very good question though. What do you do with something like this? The support for Brexit, actually it was politically organized within the legal frames that were offered. And, but that itself would indicate, you know, the question is, what if they were adamantly pro-Brexit, or if they didn't participate at all? What would that say about political incorporation? I'm not sure you need to take a position on everything to be politically incorporated. Right? I mean, sometimes I think we demand too much by using these measures. They didn't take a stand on things that say I find important. Yeah. Where actually, it's not I'm arguing for depoliticization or say apathy, but some way I am arguing for depoliticization. That there's some things that shouldn't be political, that you simply accept and other bodies make decisions about them. Yeah. So that would be my kind of evading of the question you're asking in a way, but still trying to answer.
Could I add something to John? Yeah. Could I add something?
Please go ahead. Yes.
So the British Indian community was also influenced by a very successful conservative strategy, which is divide and rule. So they immediately created this kind of opposition between Britain in the EU and Britain in the world.
Yes, exactly.
So in order to advertise the Brexit project, because it was a project, and to convince people about it, they were knocking on the doors, particularly of minority communities, promising them liberal migration regimes, liberal recruitment policies, that once free movement of persons will stop and all those European EU citizens will not come, we'll be able to welcome citizens from other parts of the world, from the subcontinent, in the subcontinent, from there. And of course, quite a lot of people believed in that. So they forgot that once a group is targeted, another group will be added to the targeted group, and another one, and another one. So targeting does not stop.
No.
With respect to the boundaries of a particular group. And so I would say that's an example of incorporation. I would say that is an example of equal manipulation of a minority community. And persons are critically, irrespective of whether they belong to majority or minority communities, accepting the narrative that is put before them. Because of course the Labour Party did not put forward a convincing alternative narrative, because Jeremy Corbyn did not campaign for Britain to remain the
Yeah, and the question that he asked, is he still here?
Yeah, he is, yeah.
Okay. Economic incorporation has to entail work. And it's a significant criteria. Too much is lumped into it. Sometimes it's like, when are you actually working in something that you may contribute to the social welfare, right? And how long do you stick in jobs? But for instance, immediately within 2 years of immigrants coming in Germany and refugees in 2015, they were saying they were working. And I thought, when would I get my first job that I stuck in? I was like 28 or so. I mean, these are like 22-year-olds. So it's just too early to measure labor incorporation, right? And so, but nonetheless, it's a very meaningful term, right? Because if you're not going to work, you're not contributing to the welfare state, and you're definitely not incorporated. And people would say you shouldn't be incorporated. And in many ways, I have sympathy for that argument.
Yeah. So is there a way in which perhaps economic incorporation is sort of valorized above political incorporation? That it's more important for you to be a contributor to the economy than it is to the polity?
Yeah. It is, and I'm not sure how I feel about that, but it's definitely over all the others, right? Labor migrants, big term, and legitimates immigration, where other forms of immigration are less legitimate, politically more disputed politically.
Yeah,
it is part of the EU system, right? So as a worker, you have far more rights.
Yeah, that's true.
So then it's
yeah. Robin, does that answer your question? And do you want to say something more?
He is shaking his head. I can see him here.
Oh, you can see him there. Okay.
He disappeared in
No,
cyberspace.
he's only on the screen. Okay.
He disappeared to your camera, to your computer.
All right. Any other questions, perhaps?
so the example of incorporation, I was wondering, so it's a mutual interpretation, you say, and can you give an example of where the social body adjusts or reconceptualizes, as let's say, response to.
Well, think of neighborhood fairs. I mean, I really try to think of everyday kind of things. I mentioned the bicycle, right? And of course, people who came who were elderly didn't learn the bicycles. You find elderly German women in their 80s, but you don't find 50-year-old men from Syria who are refugees. So some things are beyond their ability or willingness to learn. But neighborhood gatherings, there's oftentimes real attempts to integrate, set up booths, food stands, for instance. So, I mean, food is one area where the Syrians moved in big time into Berlin and took over many Turkish spaces. When you go deeper into this, you understand who's financing these restaurants, oftentimes Palestinians in Berlin who have money, who've been there for a while, not the new Palestinians from Syria. So so that's interesting. And the Palestinians don't have a relationship with the Turks, really. And the Turks, of course, didn't like this. And on the whole, I would say they tend to be hostile to Syrians in Germany, who they're competing with, not just for restaurant space, but also for the category Middle Easterners. For instance, Turkish intellectuals, boy, do they get huffy when I talk about Syrian refugees, because they control that whole domain of discourse about Middle Easterners, and they aren't even necessarily Middle Eastern, right? But people from this area. So they have to sort of make room for new voices, including Syrian voices, Syrian students. For instance, it's true that Syrian students got admitted to universities more quickly. Turks didn't, right? They had to struggle to enter the university, but on the whole, of course, they came from guest worker families, and many of Syrians came from more intellectual families, so let's say college-educated families. So there are differences here, but the point is, your question, is about
The social body and how.
the social body. So the social body of state cuisine in Berlin, that is part of the social body. You can hardly find German restaurants anymore. Nobody really likes German food. It's too heavy, right? And Yugoslavian food, which made a big splurge, say, with the crisis in the wars in the former Yugoslavia, don't go there. Their restaurants have declined. And Vietnamese, where in the world did they come from? Post-90, they almost took over the space of Italians who dominated so much. So here we have Syrian food, what was Arabic food? It was Egyptian, not one of the high Arabic cuisines. Really, really mediocre. And Syrian is excellent. So anyway, so there's a way in which this contributes. Now, not that if Germans eat Syrian or Arabic food, they all think positively about Syrians now, or Arabs, but the social body changes in the sense that they're consuming different things. For instance, it has to do with more Germans being vegetarian or wanting food that's not so meat-based. Well, not that Syrian food couldn't be meat-based, but there's always vegetables, so there's always fresh versus cooked, right? So there's a way in which they bring things that change the whole landscape, what Germans do without them knowing. I mean, I find it interesting, the veiled women, right? Now, my sisters used to have to veil when they went to Catholic church, so I know that's part of the Christian tradition. Also, but the idea that you have these women veiled and unveiled next to each other, it's become almost a non-issue in Berlin. Now, I'm not sure what it would be in some smaller cities, right? Where the Germans would eat next to them in these places and walk in the street next to them because they're not isolated in one neighborhood. At the same time, the idea of a parallel society, say, the ghetto idea, that they all move to the same place, maybe because they didn't all come from lower classes, they didn't want that. They didn't want to live on Marxstrasse, Hermannstrasse. They didn't want to live in those areas that initially they loved the fact that this was mini Damascus. You could buy everything you could in Damascus, but they didn't want to live there. And so that's happened to Turks too. So that is also changing the social body. For a long time, way back when, before I even started this, I always looked at names on apartment buildings, right? To see what kind of, are there only German names? And it's amazing how integrated the city is in many ways, right? In the center, at least. So this is also a social body that has differences that aren't even recognized as significant. That's important.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of, if there's no other comment, I'm kind of interested in this because on the one hand, you do see that, I see that a lot in the Netherlands. But on the other hand, in the articulations of what it means to be Dutch, all of that still feels like it's kind of subsidiary or secondary to that Dutch citizenship. So yes, I mean, I get my groceries at the Moroccan store and I can cross the road and go to the Indian store, but being Dutch and all of that is fine, and that's the social body has adapted. But the idea formally of being Dutch still seems to be rather exclusive in that sense. So I
You're
guess
right.
again, there's a little perhaps
You're right.
slippage between those.
There is, and I would say being Dutch is called ontology, who you are. Where becoming Dutch is a process. A child becomes Dutch, they're not born Dutch, right? So if we shift our own questions to say, I want to learn how Dutch people learn to be Dutch. So for instance, I mentioned in the talk I gave, the interest in the birth scene, right? Where a German Syrian married, she has a baby, how much she appreciated the care she gets from the state here. But the point is that all women experience in Germany when they have babies. And this is an experience of becoming German, that the midwife comes for 2 weeks or something. So, you know what, your particular issue is that being registered by Germans, right? Are they actually acknowledging that this is happening?
No, I mean, no, not really, because the Dutch are acknowledging that it's happening. We can all see it. But I'm not really sure if the kind of political discourse on being Dutch or becoming Dutch necessarily acknowledges it. So it's happening, but it doesn't seem to have translated into the legal articulations of that.
Yeah.
So
no, that's exactly what I'm saying. It's not really being registered, right? And the question is why? And part of it is journalism, academics who constantly focus on the ontological question of who you are instead of who am I becoming in this group. And we have, I'm not all for multiplicity and but not all the time. But yes, right, because it's not a response here necessarily. But the point is that the instability of the social, we witness it everywhere. Right, in the sense that the socials are changing, they're up for grabs. People are insecure because they lose their sense that they're in a social today. And that is an opportunity to reoccupy that space with forms of understanding of difference that makes sense to people, that they're experiencing something they don't register, right? And I think that's very important. And certainly because of the high birth rate, say, of Turks, people from Middle East immigrants in Germany, I assume it's probably true here also, right?
I don't know about the birth rates. I have no idea. I'm always a little sort of hesitant about what I read because it's, at least in India, I know that that's also fairly politicized discourse, that of birth rates of minority communities.
It is. But the thing is, to register it is to say, these are the people who are going to be taking care of me when I'm older, who are going to work in the shops, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to be creating the income to support the social welfare state. We have to invest in these. And there is that discourse also, I assume.
Yeah, there is,
Yeah, and that has to simply be more frequently articulated, I would say. When you're reporting about these differences and problems in the community and whatnot.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Any questions in the chat? What's the little one?
Oh, that's on more than something that's.
Oh, okay, well, in that case, I just want to thank both our speakers for engaging with us. It's been lovely talking with both of you and hearing about your work. And thank you all for also being here. Thank you, Leah and Dachi, also for helping out, and everyone on Zoom for attending.